Hello, and thank you for visiting my channel. This is my two-part series on my documentary finishing workflow. If you're bringing a documentary project in for a landing, then this video series should help demystify a little bit of the nuts and bolts that go on underneath the surface when we prepare a project for finishing, and then when we take it to the finishing facility or the finishing company, and some of the things that they expect from you and what they'll give you back in return. I split this video into two primary parts. Part one is more on the editor's perspective and how an editor or your editorial team might prepare the project for your finishing team. And then part two is more from the finishing team's perspective and how they import that conform from your editor or from your editorial team, and how they take those project files and split them between the colorist and the restoration artist, all of the quality control or QC that goes on behind the scenes and all the labor and time that's involved in that process. And I think by the end of this video, you'll get a much better sense of how much work is involved, the time that it takes to do this type of stuff, and what's expected from your team members in terms of quality control and making sure that the turnovers and the whole conform process and round trip, as we call it, from your editorial to the finishing house and then back to your editor, that round trip, we want to make sure that whole thing happens very smoothly for you. So this is my main workflow diagram for a documentary finishing workflow. We move from left to right. We start on the first pane over here on the left. This is our editor with a picture lock. Whether they are cutting in Premiere, Avid, Vegas, Final Cut X, it doesn't matter, okay? All is the same here. It's the same workflow. How you get out of that nonlinear editor software may be a little bit different, and that's up to you. Maybe we'll do a follow-up video on different NLE and options, but suffice to say that this is universal. We have a picture lock. So then the editor puts all of that media and the files and deliverables onto a hard drive or inside of some sort of a share folder online. And then that gets sent to the finishing house where the colorist and the restoration artist does their magic on the film. And then that is exported and deliverables are made and then sent back to our editor, who will then handle the mastering and then the final deliverables and the QC and all that stuff. Just remember, we're moving from left to right, and the media and all the deliverables have to be handed off a few times in the process. The turnover is when an editor hands all the deliverables over to the finishing house. The finishing house does all of their magic, and then they hand that back to the editor. Those are called turnovers. And that happens twice in this diagram, although it could happen more or less depending on your situation. So just a couple of housekeeping things about this diagram to make clear. The source symbol here, you're going to see that a few different places in the diagram. And this just indicates every time you see this little symbol, that means that that person or that team member or that step of the process is going to have all of the source material, right? That's either a hard drive or that's a link to download those files. The conform symbol, you'll see this a few places. You'll also see yellow, the sort of gold color, in a couple of different places. That symbol means that somebody's going to have to do a conform and a watch down or a watch down. That means there's a QC part of that process. As we're discussing, this is a conform. The edit, conform out, this is conform, there's a QC involved. So someone's in charge. Every time you see this golden symbol, someone is in charge of sitting down and watching the entire movie and making sure that it matches the reference and making sure there aren't glitches and dropped out frames or files that haven't had color applied or something like that. So these symbols are just to help you kind of gauge a sense of, oh, wow, that's a lot of work involved in this step. Or, oh, somebody's going to have a hard drive with a couple terabytes of media on it. I'm going to have to send that out. The other thing that you should notice are these little stickies here that I've placed a couple different at a couple different points in the pipeline are the temp mix, temp titles, and temp graphics, because these three items are oftentimes being made in parallel as color and the rest of finishing. So typically when I'm doing color delivery or restoration deliverables, the mix is still temporary. Now, if I can get the version 1 of the mix, I'll try and drop it in and line it up with the 2-pop and make sure that that mix, the new mix, is in with every version of color moving forward. And the reason why is because I like my directors and the filmmakers I work with, when they are reviewing in the finishing process, I want them to review with the latest of everything. Okay? Because otherwise they're going to be distracted. And they're going to say, oh, that sound is still there. It's like, you're not here to review sound. You're here to review color. And you booked 10 hours with me today, and you're paying $100 to $125 an hour in the color suite that's not even counting the rental on the room, right? You're paying all this time, and yet your consciousness is split in between worrying about sound and worrying about color. It's like, I want you to be focused on one thing. So I like the reviews to have as much of the latest in them as possible. So that way the filmmaker gets to see the film come alive with all of the latest and finishing. Because otherwise the director is going to have to wait till the very, 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 very last final review to finally see the movie as they intended. And that's dangerous for everyone involved, because that's when you finally get, you'll get final requests and tweaks and changes. You have to go back all the way back upstream to make those changes. And that becomes a scheduling issue. So it's really, I think it's important for whoever is in charge of supervising the finishing process, whether that's a post-producer or your editor or your producer. It really depends. Sometimes there'll be a post-producer or like a post-supervisor, someone involved in the email chains who's kind of keeping tabs on where everything is at. Okay, we got mix over at this post house. We got color and restoration over at Zach's place. We've got the composer working on stuff over here, who's then having to upload the assets to the sound mix. You've got a lot of different things happening in parallel. So the director never really gets to see the final film in its versioning. And so I think it's important that whoever's in charge of the post management tries and coordinates the schedule in such a way that the reviews happen with all of the latest asset coming from each member of the finishing team. So try and coordinate it that way. Otherwise, your director is going to be a little confused or distracted in the review process. The last thing I wanted to just point out are the lines here that I have connecting different assets and the sort of the flow of information. Anything that's a orange line is a request or a pull or a communication between team members. It's usually, hey, you gave me the wrong asset, or hey, this isn't working, I need something else. Anything with a red line is essentially saying, hey, we're moving on. This is the next step of the process. So it's red because it's critical. The editor is sending the locked edit deliverables to the post-finishing house. That's a red line. The post-finishing house is doing the conform, and they're sending it to the color. That's a red line. Okay, so that's just a little tip on this workflow. Once you've picture locked, duplicate your timeline and then rename it to something like conform for finishing or conform for color. The reason we do that is so that you can easily tell the difference between your hero timeline, the one that you've picture locked, the one that is actually your movie, and the one that you're going to be sending and preparing to send to the finishing house or the finishing team. After you've duplicated your timeline, now you can duplicate your project file. And this is all just redundancies and backups and creating multiple copies so that in this process, if you mess up, you can always kind of come back. There's always an undo. There's always a redo. Next, you should reconnect all of the media on your timeline to the source. Now, this is particularly important if you have created proxy files, or if you've used some format or done some sort of transcodes to your archival media, or if you're working with a archival producer and during the picture edit, they've been securing the rights to all the archival media, and they've found higher quality versions of the media now that they have access to it, or media that doesn't have a watermark on it. They should send those files to you. You can swap it out. The point being that before you send a documentary to a finishing house, you need to make sure that all of the media on the timeline is connected to the source. We want to make sure that we're working with the highest quality media possible. Now, as painful as it might be, we need to also remove the color and the LUTs from your timeline. And this is because the colorist and the restoration artist, they don't necessarily want to be working with something that's already been color graded. It's not like they can just unwind it or turn it off or undo it. It's baked into the clip if you give it to them this way. So we don't want to give them the file that way. And we also don't want to give them a project file. If the post house is doing the conform for you, you can let them handle all of it, or you can do it yourself. Regardless, I mean, you're going to be using up the time and racking up billable hours on the finishing side if you don't do it yourself. So this is a good job for an assistant editor or someone on your team who could just go through and turn off the LUTs or turn off the color grading effects if you've used the color grading tools in your nonlinear editor. Now, the next 3 suggestions on my steps to consider section are removing the clip timing, removing the warp stabilization, and also removing keyframes. This is optional for you, and it really depends on a lot of things. For example, if you're giving your colorist a timeline and you just want to remove all attributes to make it easy, well, that's fine, but someone's going to have to put those attributes back on. So for example, if you have resized, or if you've warp stabilized, or you've keyframed some camera movements or something into a clip, that's going to have to be recreated later once the project comes back to you, or you're going to have to ask your finishing house to recreate those attributes for you on the conform. Both of those options are expensive. I think the easier way to do this, and this is something that I suggest to my clients, is if you have retiming, warp stabilization, or keyframes on, say, like a digital cinema clip, like something that was shot in S-Log, S-Gamut 3.cine, there's nothing wrong with you baking that effect into that clip as a ProRes 422HQ clip. There's negligible data loss when you are transcoding from the original source. If let's say your source is an S-Log 3 S-Gamut 3.cine Sony FX6 clip, right? When you go to ProRes 422HQ, there's no data loss when you transcode to that mezzanine codec. So you can bake those, whether it's the warp stabilization, the keyframing, the retiming, the repositioning, the transforms, you can bake that into the clip, just render it as it is, and then give your colorist that clip. Now for archival media, that's not something you want to do. The restoration artist should be the one to do that, unless you've had a separate conversation with them and they think that they can transform that clip or stabilize it in a way that their tools will offer better quality. But I'm just saying that, like, if you're going to give a timeline to a colorist and none of the positioning and the warp stabilization has been affected, that's going to be one of 2 things. Is number 1, to ask them to do that, it's going to be very expensive to redo that. And number 2, you're not going to be seeing the reviews, the color and restoration reviews, with any of the stabilization or transforms put on the clip. And that's usually a problem for directors. I want the director to see the film as it was in the locked edit, plus the color, plus the restoration, not minus anything else. Because what ends up happening is directors get very upset or distracted. They're like, what happened to the stabilization? Why is this shot so shaky? And they're not thinking about the color or restoration. Like, that's the problem for me. Then we're not in finishing anymore. We're back in the edit. And I like my directors and the clients that I work with, I like them to be able to see the film as it should be, as it was in the edit, plus the beautiful color grading on top. So I recommend baking a lot of the stuff in. Otherwise, you're going to have to recreate that in the conform. So it's cheaper for your assistant editor to do it when you do the conform out than it is for an assistant editor or for a post facility to do it when they conform in. So let's say you have a clip. Let's say there's like 10 clips on your timeline that have some stabilization on it. Okay. Well, in my opinion, warp stabilization is better in Premiere Pro than it is in DaVinci Resolve. And I would tell my client that. I would say, I'd watch the timeline and have a conversation with them on our initial brief call, our briefing. I never take on a project without having a conversation with without having a conversation with the team about, like, well, the pedigree of the project. Where's this been? What have you done to it? What all kinds of effects are there? I need to know this kind of stuff before you give me a feature timeline full of 1,000 clips with all kinds of effects on them, because I need to know how many billable hours I'm going to have to deal with. And so does the client. They want to know how much it's going to cost. Well, warp stabilization is really good in Premiere. So I would suggest to the client, like, bake those in. Just bake it in. ProRes 422HQ, ProRes 444, whatever the source codec is, as long as the mezzanine, your ProRes encode, is meets or exceeds the quality of the source, then that's fine because it's lossless. Warp stabilization is a no-brainer. Retiming, it kind of depends on the situation. Generally speaking, for documentary, and this is just a brutally honest opinion, doc filmmakers never have any money. Never. It's always a resource shy industry. So my suggestion to editors is bake in the retiming, bake in the warp stabilization, and bake in the keyframes and transforms. You've positioned them, you moved them in the edit, and someone made that creative decision. Someone made the executive decision to do that. Bake it in. If you want to continue to have the flexibility throughout post to like, let's zoom out a little bit. No, let's zoom in. Well, guess what? You're working with you're going to have to recreate that in the colorist timeline. If your director wants to have that freedom in the color suite or during the color and mastering and finishing review process, if they still want to have options to edit or to zoom or to destabilize, that's expensive. I'm just going to be honest with you right now. Because somebody in the finishing house is going to have to make those tweaks, and that's all billable hours. And billable hours in finishing are much more expensive than billable hours in editorial. Just a quick tip. Okay, no brainer here, but I got to say it just because it's really critical. We got to add a 2-pop to the head of your track. And the timeline time code technically should be agreed upon amongst everyone on the team. Sometimes timelines start at 00, sometimes timelines start at 01. Sometimes they start at negative 59, like negative 58, something or other, because you want to start your actual film at 01000000 time code. These are all decisions that have to be agreed upon in your initial meeting, because once your finishing house gets the files, they need to know what the master time code is. If you've had a properly conformed timeline, then this should have been sorted out to begin with. But always add the 2-pop, because everyone on your finishing team, the colorist, the restoration artist, the sound mixer, the sound designer, the composer, everyone is going to be working from a timeline, and they need to be working from the same time code. And so if notes come back later during the finishing process and not everyone's on the same sync, well, then that's we've lost the point here. So the 2-pop is really important. Don't forget it. Another thing that I love to do, and then I ask editors that I work with to do, is to segregate the assets by track. So video track 1 and video track 2 are typically reserved for camera A and camera B respectively. Camera B being like close-ups or whatever, or maybe it's B-roll, right? So camera A is all the hero footage, track 1 is all the hero footage, track 2 is all of your B-roll, track 3 is archival, right? Which is really handy to put archival on its own track for the restoration artist and for your archival producer and for everyone on the team, really. And then track 4 might be graphics, track 5 might be titles. You see what I'm saying? So separating the assets by track is really handy, because then everyone else on the team in the finishing house can then turn off different tracks to export different parts of the asset or different parts of the timeline. And then when it comes to replacing assets, so oftentimes in the finishing process, the titles are still being worked on, because that's part of the finishing, right? You've got color, sound, music, titles, graphics, archival, restoration. There's all of these different things that can be operated on parallel or simultaneously during the finishing process. So I may end up getting new titles from someone. And man, let me tell you how great it is to get a set of new titles version 2. And it comes with an XML, because then I can just bring that in as an XML as a timeline, and then copy and paste that into track 6 or copy and paste that into track 5. And when you give someone an XML with new titles, don't put it on track 1. Keep it on track 6 or track 5, whatever track we've all agreed on is the graphics or titles track. Keep it in that track. So that way when I export that XML or import that XML, I just copy paste it into my track. It's in the right time code. We're all synced up. It's in the right track. It's just copy paste, easy peasy, no more billable hours. So you don't get a bill for $75 because I had to fiddle with your titles for an hour. Also, if I'm working with a bunch of archival media and they're physical assets that I need to supervise to do the transfers at a tape facility, at a transfer facility, I will ask for a manifest. Just a simple spreadsheet that says everything that's in the box. But if you're working on an archival project and you, as the finishing house, also happen to be responsible for doing the digitization or transfers, then make sure that you ask for a manifest. If you are the facility that's doing the editorial, make sure you make a manifest for your finishing facility if you're going to be handing over those tapes. We just need to make sure that we have everything throughout the entire pipeline. Making deliverables is sort of a sacred process for finishing teams. When we receive the deliverables, those deliverables are sacred because they are pure and untouched, and they have been QC'd, we assume, by editorial. So everything that we receive, we assume that it's gold. We assume that that's the truth, the ground truth, okay? And everything that we generate as a deliverable after this is also sacred, and it must match one-to-one the deliverables that we received from our client, sans the changes that we've applied, of course. So when it comes to deliverables, the primary usual suspects are generating an XML, a reference movie with time code baked into the image, a reference movie without time code. And the reason I like that is because sometimes I like to see the image as it originally was, and there may be something behind the time code that I need to see, and I don't want there to be any sort of confusion. I don't want to have to make that request later. Once I receive the deliverables, I want to hit the ground running and go. So with and without timecode reference movies, the source media or the raw media, whatever you want to call it, so long as all of the source that's on the timeline is in a hard drive or in a file that is to be downloaded from the internet and it's been vouched for, the project file or the timeline file. If you're working in Premiere Pro to edit your movie, chances are the post facility also works with Premiere Pro, and they may want to get into the timeline and like just grab an asset for themselves real quick without having to bug your entire editorial team to like, hey, you generate this section of the timeline for us. We something happened, it's corrupted, or oh, well, we just want to double check the timeline real quick just to double check the reference. There could be a million reasons why you'd want to go back to the original project file or the original timeline. It doesn't matter. I just assume give us the Premiere Pro project file. That way we can generate our own assets if we need to without bugging you. Now this becomes a question of billing and privacy, or you want to protect your rights. There may be a non-disclosure agreement involved in this whole process. Anyway, regardless, it's totally normal for a post-finishing facility to ask for your project file, or at the very least, a timeline. If I'm working with an editor that's working in DaVinci Resolve or Premiere, I'll ask them to send me a timeline or a project file. If they're working in DaVinci Resolve, I will definitely ask them for a DRT, which is a DaVinci Resolve timeline. And it's super simple. And it's clean, and it often conforms more accurately than a Premiere Pro conform does. So that's my preference. But of course, I work in DaVinci Resolve. I'm a little biased. And the other thing that I put in the deliverables is the documentation. That includes the manifest. That includes any sort of emails that you had from your DP saying, hey, we shot on this camera and we shot S-Log 3, S-Log, S-Gamut 3.cine. We shot on Panasonic EVA with the V-Log. Yeah, that sort of documentation is very important for your colorist to know. Any sort of details like that. Also, when it comes to archival, if you have any information on the original source media you can provide for your restoration artist, all of this information is helpful. It can be as simple as just a couple of notes from your DP in an email all the way to transfer media manifest. Doesn't matter. Documentation is always helpful. Emails with context are helpful for your finishing house. So I would compile that and put that in. Sometimes I'll add the manifest as like a spreadsheet and then a few notes as like a README file and a .txt file in the hard drive in the parent folder. Or I'll make a folder called documentation. As long as there's communication clearly between myself and the editorial on like, hey, here's what I'm giving you. This is where it's from. This is what it was shot on. Good luck. As long as there's some sort of communication, that's fine. Otherwise, assumptions are the only thing I have to go with. And when it comes to color science and getting the color transforms correct, I always like to do my due diligence. And I'll message the director or the producer and be like, hey, or the post producer and be like, hey, can I get an email to your DP? I just want to talk with them real quick. Like, what do they shoot this on? What's the color science? I just want to make sure I know, and that's all it goes into getting good skin tones. Better color science and documentation means better skin tones. It means more softly rolled off highlights. It means better reproduction of your archival media. Any sort of documentation you provide us is great. I have something called the turnover, which I've listed in 2 different primary points of this process. And that's the turnover. And a turnover is just like a general way of describing handing a conformed project over to another part of the pipeline. So in this case, the editor makes the conform and then generates the deliverables and then takes that either in a hard drive or through an emailed link that they can download all of the assets and files that they need to then finish and master the project. They hand that over to to finishing. And the turnover includes going all the way back to the initial phone call, the onboarding with the post-finishing facility. They should send you an email that probably has a document with their best practices and their conform requirements. Most post facilities do this because if you can imagine, if you're doing hundreds of films a year and then everyone's just giving you a hard drive that's a mess, you're going to be billing a lot of hours. Turning over a documentary for finishing is a big job. It's generating the best practices and the requirements documents to making sure that everything is there, having the manifest. If there's physical media involved, then that's a whole other bag of cats. But suffice to say that the turnover is somebody is responsible for communicating with the post facility, between the post facility and editorial, to make sure that each of those teams has what they need to move forward, and then physically or digitally transferring those assets over to the other team then validating that they have everything that they need and everything looks good on their end, and then it conforms. I know that's a confusing use of the word conform here, but that your workflow is conforming to the requirements of the post-finishing facility. Big post-finishing facilities will have very specific requirements. You can't just give them a hard drive with your timeline on it. You got to give it to them prepped and ready to go. And if you don't do that, be prepared for a very large bill. So moving on to the finishing section of our diagram, I just want to point out that in the finishing section, I have a new position titled Project Manager, sort of like in the overarching role of responsibility for managing a lot of this pipeline. This can come in a couple of different ways and in a couple of different forms. You may have a post-production supervisor or post manager who is overseeing the entire process. And if that's the case, then you're so lucky. And it's great for your production to have someone like that on your team. But most documentaries don't have that. The more independent the documentary, the lower the budget, the more scrappy and DIY we have to be. And I feel like that's part of my audience for this YouTube channel is people that are having to do things on their own or figure it out on their own because they work in documentary and they're scrappy and they're smart and they're having to make use of of their little limited resources that they have. So project manager is a bit of a nebulous, overarching kind of role that I've created in this diagram. But suffice to say that someone has to be responsible for maintaining communication with the client, in this case, the editorial side, the production company that has requested or hired the finishing facility. Someone has to maintain communication with them when new assets come in. And also, since there are so many moving parts in a finishing facility, you may have a restoration artist, a colorist, a sound mixer, and 1 or 2 different assistant editors working on one project simultaneously. And so all of them have to be coordinated with their schedules, and deadlines have to be met. And if those deadlines start seeing some slippage, then that has to be communicated with the client. Anyway, I liked all of that stuff to be coordinated in such a way that all of the reviews for everything happen at the same time. And that requires coordination, and it requires someone in the process being in charge of keeping tabs on this. So the project manager is in charge of making sure that the project is conformed, that the reviews happen on schedule, that everyone on the staff and the team is just communicating clearly and is up to date with all of the latest information being passed down from the client. So just keep that in mind. So when the finishing team receives a hard drive or a link to download the source files or the files and deliverables from the editor, the first thing that they need to do is they need to set up their project settings in whichever software they're using. So in my case, DaVinci Resolve, I want to be doing the Conform in DaVinci Resolve because I do color and restoration all within DaVinci Resolve. That's kind of my home base. Other facilities may use Baselight or whatever, but I use DaVinci Resolve. So I'll set up my DaVinci Resolve project file correctly first and set it to the standards of the deliverables. So let's say 3840 by 2160, 23.976 frame rate. Let's say a couple other settings. I'll set up my DaVinci Resolve project file, and then I'll set my timeline settings. Maybe your documentary is only in 1920 by 1080. Maybe your documentary is in PAL. It's 25 frames per second. So you want to set up your project settings, and then you want to set up your timeline settings, and then you want to add a two-pop, of course, because we all need to be on the same page. And add the two-pop at the head of your timeline. If you need to reapply the keyframes and the retiming and interpolation and the stabilization, now would be the time to do it. If the post facility is responsible for handling that, then this is where it would happen. Now you have a couple of different decisions that you can make after you've reapplied some of the effects like keyframes and retiming and all this stuff. You can render that and just bake it into a new ProRes 422HQ file, or you can leave it. It's just more things that you're going to have to render later. And by baking something in, you are making that decision permanent, and there's no way for it to get messed up later. So have that decision with your team. It doesn't always make sense in every project, but it makes sense in most. So once you have set your project settings and your timeline settings and all of that matches the specs of your deliverables, then arguably the most important part of this process comes next, and that is importing your reference movie that you received from PictureLock, from the editor, and validating your new conform timeline in your color software, your mastering software, in my case, DaVinci Resolve, making sure that your timeline is frame accurate down to your reference movie. And also spatially, you want to make sure that the files are positioned, the clips are positioned in the right place, that the keyframing has been done accurately, that's rendered. Make sure that everything matches the reference movie down to the frame. If it's not done correctly now, then those problems are going to ripple to everyone else on the team for the rest of the process, all the way to final output. And it becomes a total nightmare to unwind that. So just spend the time, just please take my advice, spend the time, watch it down, make sure it's frame accurate. There's a couple of different methods to do this. I use the difference matte display in DaVinci Resolve. I put the reference movie on the timeline above everything else, and then I set it to composite difference mode, and then I watch it. And anything that's slightly, even if it's a frame off, it'll pop, it'll highlight. And I watch the whole movie like that just to make sure. And it's well worth it. If it's a 2-hour long movie, it's only 2 hours out of a whole post-production schedule that you have to spend just to make sure that it's right. And once it's done, once it's validated to the reference, I usually send a little email to my client saying, hey, everything looks good. We're moving forward. Let's go. And I think constant communication with a client can be annoying, but I do like to send my clients little courtesy messages or little courtesy emails of encouragement saying, hey, we finished this really critical step in the process. Everything's good. We're moving on. Let's go. Of course, you don't want to forget your two-pop at the head of your track. And of course, by lining up your reference movie, you're going to need to have aligned a two-pop anyway. We want to validate, like I had said in the reference movie, you want to validate that all the transforms, if those were not baked into the clips that were given to you by the editor or baked into a picture lock, then you'll need to validate those, but that'll come across in your reference movie validation if anything is off. But you may have to do some slight adjustments. Sometimes it happens. Other times, especially if you're working with archival, there's always going to be a little bit of slippage. So for example, I made a little diagram here that gives an example of what may happen between two different clips on a timeline. Let's say this is video track 1, this is video track 2. Video track 1 is your original timeline clips, whatever the editor was using. Now that could have been a ProRes proxy, it could have been an MPEG-4 or something, or maybe it was an archival clip that the archival producer now found a higher quality version. And on video track 2 is the new replacement asset. It's the original source material or the original source archival or digital cinema clip. But what ends up happening when you're conforming on different machines at different pieces of software using different file exchange formats, almost always there's going to be a few clips on the timeline that have what we call slippage. And that just means it's like slipped a couple frames. And there's a couple of simple tools you can use in Resolve just to kind of realign those clips better. The slip tool, just slip it back. And I use the composite mode difference overlay when I'm trying to reslip a clip. And I made a video for that, which I'll share down in the description below if you want an example of how to quickly go through your timeline and realign the temporal slippage. This is particularly helpful when you're working with a project where the client has requested handles on everything, so they want to make changes later. Slippage happens all the time because you're working with a clip that has more media than is what is being shown on the timeline, so that there may be some discrepancy. Also, if your source material was interlaced and a progressive clip was made or generated for the timeline for whatever reason, well, it's deinterlaced the file and it's reintegrated the field lines in such a way that the video may be a frame or two off in either direction, and that's very common. It's to be expected anytime you're working with archival media, so watch out for the slippage. Now, if you're going to reapply the keyframing and retiming and all that stuff in the finishing process, totally fine, as long as that's communicated and there's a reference movie so that the assistant editor in the finishing house can make that, accurate recreation on their timeline. That's fine. But the one thing that I would say might be a little confusing for people, and this is sort of a mystery, is whether or not you need to reinterpolate certain media on your timeline to 2398. And I'm bringing this up because I have a lot of clients that ask this all the time. It's a case-by-case basis, and you should speak with your restoration artist or your colorist about this beforehand. Now, this really pertains to clips that are archival and you're not going to do an archival restoration, or you don't really care. There's just archival clips. You've got old news clips that you ripped from YouTube or something on your timeline. Maybe you don't care. Maybe the interpolation algorithms that are used for playing back media that has a different frame rate from your mastering frame rate, which in most of our case on our timeline is 2398 or 23.976. 99% of us don't even care. It is what it is. And the deinterlacing and all that stuff is just handled underneath the hood, and whatever we get, we're going to get. But actually there's a proper way to handle mixed frame rate formats. If you have a project that has a bunch of different mixed frame rates, then I think it's worth having a conversation with someone at your finishing team about, hey, listen, like a third of my timeline is 2997 because it was ripped from DVDs, or maybe it was captured from mini DV, or there's some old VHS tapes, or enigmatic, or 3/4 inch, or whatever, Betacam. Not all interpolation algorithms are created equally, and there's often a better way of doing something. And it's also less render time. Well, that's it for part 1. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you'd like to see underneath the hood of the finishing facility or the finishing team's sort of inner workings and how they take the deliverables from your editorial team and then import those and go through the whole finishing process and then round trip that back to your editorial team, then stay tuned for part 2. You can find the link to that video in the description below. Please like and subscribe this video if you found it helpful, and I look forward to seeing you on the next one.